I can't tell you how excited I am to be here this morning for just so many reasons. One of the pleasures of ministry is you get to see so many different places and meet so many different people, and this has been one of those. When the invitation came, would you like to go to speak? It came originally, would you like to speak? It's about an hour and a half from Nashville. We live in Nashville, Tennessee. And then when I began to investigate, they were thinking it's about an hour and a half. It's farther from Searcy, but they were thinking in Searcy terms than Nashville, Tennessee. I didn't realize I was going to drive almost to Texarkana to see all of you this morning. And, of course, the farther we drove yesterday, the farther it got. Jane and I, she's right back here. We live in Nashville, Tennessee. About 35 years ago, we moved to Nashville from Texas. So we have lived in Texas and Oklahoma and Tennessee and Kingston, Jamaica. So we have seen and visited with a lot. But until the invitation came, I didn't know there was a Nashville, Arkansas. And then when we left the house this morning, I started seeing all these signs, and it was not Nashville. And I'm going, where are we? So I've been really confused. I'm beginning to get it straightened out. But then I saw the sign a little while ago this morning, Nashville and Murfreesboro. And we have a Nashville and Murfreesboro where we live. So this has been a real learning experience. I know very little about you, and you know very little about me. So Jane and I have been in ministry all our lives. We met at Abilene Christian University. And I began preaching as soon as I got out of college. That was the only thing you did back when I graduated. We had no youth ministers, no education ministers, no involvement ministers, no ministers of management. We did have some missionaries, but she and I began that many, many years ago, and we have been in ministry ever since. We're now retired, and we live in a retirement village in Nashville called the Meadows. So every morning I get up and look outside, and I'm surrounded by old people, of which I are one. And it's just been such a unique experience. We were there about 3 or 4 years, and then they said, would you and your wife be chaplains? And so officially, we're the chaplains there. We have a nursing home, and it deals with standard nursing care and assisted living and memory care. Then we have independent living. That's where we are. We have about 100 houses. And then across town, we have another facility like that, and we have obligations there too. So the Church of Christ, many years ago, implemented this. Where we are was started by a woman who had a farm and said, I'd like to donate this farm to the church with one prerequisite. I want it to be used for older people. And so that started the process many years ago. We have 3 grown children. We have 7 grandchildren. Our oldest granddaughter is 28. She's about to get married this next April, so we're excited about that. There's nothing like grandkids. So if you don't have any, I'm sorry. We had a rule we would get them and spoil them as much as we could and give them back. And it's kind of worked pretty good. We have really enjoyed Nashville, Tennessee. And we are learning to really love your country here, because this is completely different. There's 82 people a day moving into Nashville, Tennessee. So building is rushed, and apartments are going up everywhere, and it's becoming a really, really big city, and we're involved in all that. I'd like to separate what I'm going to say here in a couple of parts. Number one, the first part is because you are in between ministers and you have a number of people coming to fill the pulpit. I would imagine, I think I'm just one of many. This is a great learning experience for you. Oh my, to see all of our personality types and delivery types and see what you like and don't like, and how different we all are. I think it's a pretty exciting thing. When I get through, and if you don't like me, you don't have to worry. I won't be back. And if you like me, then that's a different thing. We just like each other. But it's just such a rich experience. Where we are, we worship with the Brentwood Hills Church of Christ, and the minister has been there 20 years. And so those poor people don't have any idea what's out there besides him. He's very good. Walt Lever's his name. And he's a hard worker, and he delivers well, and he really takes care of that church. It's about 1,500 people, one of the largest in Nashville. But you have this rich experience every Sunday to come in here and say, well, let's see what this fellow's got. And it can be that kind of experience. The second is, regardless of your history and regardless of the events that brought you to this moment in time, this is a rich time in each of your lives in which you, if you choose, you have the opportunity to watch God work. The Bible is just so much. It's history, it's doctrine, it's theory, it's reminiscing like the Psalms, it's projections like Revelation. But I think the Bible is really just a storybook of how God has worked with man and women. And right now you have that same experience. You can get caught up in what's happened in the past, or what's going to happen in the future, or what we used to be, or where we are now, et cetera, and your mind can just go crazy with that kind of stuff. Or you can simply say, God, you're in charge, and I'm going to be faithful to you, and I'm going to open the doors of my heart and mind, and I'm asking you to now do a mighty thing for our church. And sit back and watch. Now, we preach all the time that the church is the Lord's church. And this is a time you can really practice it. It's not a time for depression. I mean, think what we've been through this last year and a half with the COVID. I mean, there were a few times, well, in Nashville, I probably hear, when we weren't permitted to meet. Did you have to close down services? Yeah. I never dreamed our churches would have to close down, ever, for any reason. And now look, God has intervened in such a way that we're back together, and we are overcoming what has been in the past. And regardless of the circumstances of how all that went, and we don't have time to get into that, but he did not forget us. And we are still alive and doing well as a nation. So, I want this to be a time of hope. It also has to be a time of reconciliation with yourself. The church is always going to deal with issues that divide us. Always. I grew up in churches where we fought over how many cups we could have in communion. Any of you remember any of that? We had one-cup churches. I participated in churches where we couldn't have running water and water fountains, and we couldn't have anything besides just a church. We certainly couldn't have a kitchen because there's a scripture, don't you have houses to eat and drink in? So we latched onto that. We attended Abilene Christian, Jane and I, when blacks were not permitted to be enrolled in Abilene Christian, and Harding was the same way. And we've moved all past that. Divorce was an issue, and we've moved past all of that. And now, whatever the issues are that we will deal with, we will deal with them as a generation. And then I've got some good news for you. When you're dead and gone, your children will be dealing with other issues. That's the way life is. And so I want to really encourage you to latch on to your faith in God. And He has not brought you to this place for you to fail. Oh, there's a lot of empty seats, but there's a lot of full seats. I love the building. It is beautiful. And from the announcements, you love each other and you care for each other. There is nothing like Church of Christ Fellowship. Wherever I go, anywhere in the world, if there is somebody who says, I'm a member of the Church of Christ, immediately we're brothers and sisters. We came in last night to a stranger's house, but it was no longer a stranger because we were brothers and sisters in Christ. And right now, you and I have the same affinity. Several things have recently happened to me that caused me to make some of these concluding remarks. Number one, I was diagnosed with an illness about 15, 20 years ago, and the doctor sent me home to decide what process to follow. And in the process of that, I began to realize I was spending too much time trying to decide to do it this way or this way. Instead, I decided to begin to see how God was going to show Himself to me through this process of illness. And He was there without dispute, intervening in my life. I had the COVID. I think I probably did one too many funerals during that pandemic. But I've told people, how do you say to your friend, I'm not going to do your mother's funeral because I might get sick? I just couldn't do it. And most of the funerals I did during the pandemic were graveside and mask. This one happened to be in a room, and then after 2 or 3 days after the funeral, my friend called and said, oh, I've been tested positive. I hope you don't get it. I don't know if I got it from that or not. But Jane and I were tested, and we were positive 5 days after our first vaccine. She was asymptomatic, no problems at all. They took me to the hospital. There was a time when I was in the ICU when I was absolutely helpless. I could not even turn myself over. Absolutely helpless. That's where you are. That's where we are all the time, without God. I decided while in the ICU, I'd better get well. I have too many people praying for me. I want them to know that prayer really works. We had people praying all over the world. I'm not a big Facebook person, but my son is, and he just sent the word out, and the words just came flowing in. And I live to tell this story. Until you're absolutely helpless, as you are now. you realize that you only have God. God can intervene, and God can make a difference, and God can take care of you. That's a big, big difference. And I want to tell you why this is so important. Later, when your family starts dealing with a divorce or a sickness or a death or a depression or an addiction or a disappointment or an anger or a murder or a jailing, you can recall this time when you and God got together and He showed you that He can make a difference in our world. I'm thrilled that I'm here. I'm thrilled you get to meet Jane. She's, I think, the best preacher's wife in the world. And she didn't start out to be a minister's wife, and I didn't start out to be a preacher. I was majoring in chemical engineering. And God saw it differently, and we're here. But I am so thrilled to meet all of you. You're happy, and you're vivacious. This guy makes the best brisket in the world. It was worth a 12-hour drive. And to see all of you here this morning on this glorious day, it's wonderful. And so that's my first sermon. It's a sermon of hope. This is a learning experience for you as a church, but for you as a person. Great learning experience. And when you see God work in you and help pull all of you together, it's going to be wonderful. Now, I tell you all of this because Jane and I have recently been through an experience where there was a church much bigger than you who floundered, and they lost everybody. This was in Nashville, and they eventually gave their facility, which was worth about $10 million, to another Church of Christ to use. So the bad things can happen, but you've got the germ of a wonderful, wonderful hope for the future here. And I really want to encourage you in that. There's a little story out of the Old Testament, is the second part of this lesson, that is one of my favorites, and I have not told it in about 15 years. One of my dear friends several years ago said, "Would you tell that story again?" And I was all ready to do it, and he's dead. He died. I didn't have a chance to tell it again. But it's a story of covenant. This is it's an Old and New Testament concept. Covenant is nothing more than two people making a promise to each other. They agree to do something. In the world that I grew up as a kid, covenant was, I'll do that, and it was the giving and the receiving of a word. That's all. Or maybe a handshake. Yeah, I'll pay this, handshake. Well, now, if you've ever bought anything, and if you've, like a car, and if you've ever borrowed money, you sign about 20 different documents. All of these are the result of a lawsuit where somebody says, well, I don't have to pay because. Now we have to notarize it. We have to sign contracts, and then we have to photograph it, and then we have to have duplicates of it, and et cetera, et cetera. But back in the Old Testament, when two people liked each other so much, they would agree to enter into covenant. Now, in some Bibles, the Old Testament and the New Testament are called Old Covenant and New Covenant. And we see this played out. I'm sure you've had wedding ceremonies right here, man and woman. Do you? All they're doing is entering into a promise with each other. You might not have thought this, but back in the day of Old Testament, when you entered into a covenant, they would exchange a garment. I was going to enter into covenant with you this morning and give you my coat, but I didn't want you to give me your shirt. But if I did that and you wore my coat, you could walk around and you would say, oh, he must be in covenant with Ken. I recognize the coat. That's what happened. They would exchange a piece of garment. Then they would sit down and they would eat a meal together. Sometimes they would feed one another. You ever see that in a wedding? Wedding cake, cut up, feed each other. It's a serious thing, but sometimes it's a humorous thing. If one of you takes a bigger bite, you've seen that in weddings. Sometimes they would drink together. But several other things went into covenant, especially out of the Old Testament. If two people went into covenant with each other, that meant you and I share everything. What I have is yours. What you have is mine. So that at the end of the month, if I'm running a little short, I wouldn't come to you and say, could I borrow $20? I would just say, let me have your checkbook. Everything you have is mine. Everything I have is yours. We share. But that's the essence of a marriage. When we enter into covenant, two people sharing everything. Another concept of this is you and I are going to enter into covenant, but my relationship with you and yours is mine also extends to our family and our children and to any other children yet unborn. So that if we were in covenant and you've got one grandson, right? Then I would say, well, if something happens to you, I'll take care of your daughter and her husband is a daughter and grandson, if anything happens. That's covenant. And a lot of that also goes on in marriages. So, two people entering into a relationship, exchanging a piece of garment, maybe eating together. I remember years ago when I was playing Cowboys and Indians. I guess we can't play Cowboys and Indians today, but I did. And I got guns given to me for Christmas, what we used to do. But I remember we would cut our arms and we would tie them together because I had seen that in the movies, become blood brothers. Guess we can't do that anymore either. But it kind of dwells on the concept of covenant. Now, this is a biblical lesson, so here's where it comes into Bible. In 1 Samuel 18, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan, remember there's King Saul, there's David who killed Goliath. He's going to be king one day. He's in Saul's court. Saul has a son named Jonathan. So Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. So the son of King Saul, his name is Jonathan, and David really like each other. They even love each other, and they become one with each other. Maybe you've had a friend like that. If you've ever had a friend like that, you're really lucky. So, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And verse 2, from that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's house. So Saul says, David, I want you to stay with me. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. So Jonathan and David decide we're going to be covenant brothers. And Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing. Remember the exchange of clothing? Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic, his sword, his bow, and his belt. Now, there's great significance in that. David is walking around, and the big thugs come and start threatening him, and then he pulls his robe back, and he says, you see this dagger right here? And you see this sword that I've got? And you see my tunic? If you dare touch me, Jonathan is going to come after you. Because this signifies I am protected by my covenant brother. Great significance. So, whatever Saul sent him to do, David did it so successfully that Saul gave him a high rank in the army. I have to skip a lot because of time, but Saul and Jonathan go out and they fight the Philistines, and they are both killed. Both of them. You can imagine how David feels. So turn with me to 2 Samuel chapter 4. I know you've heard this story, but 2 Samuel chapter 4. Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son. He was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. His name was Mephibosheth. All right, here's the king. Here's his son. They're killed in battle. The word comes back to the palace. You better run because the Philistines are right behind us, and they've just killed the king and his son, and they're following us. And the nurse grabs up the little boy and in her haste drops him, and he is crippled for the rest of his life because of the haste that she used to escape the palace. This is a really crucial part of the story. His name is Mephibosheth. Turn to 2 Samuel 9. All right, we're going to have to skip a few years in time, but I'd like to transition in this story and make you a part of it. I'm going to name all of you Mephibosheth. I want you to be Mephibosheth. And here's how you can become a part of this story. As long as you can remember, you've been crippled. It happened when you were very young, but as long as you can remember, you've been crippled. And as long as you can remember, you've been in hiding in a little desert place called Lodebar. And as long as you can remember, those who are taking care of you have told you this: you better never let David the king find out you're alive, because you're a descendant to the throne. Direct descendant. You have a right to the throne that King David now sits on. And if he ever finds out you're alive, he's going to take you and kill you, and you don't have a chance of living. As long as you are alive, you folks, you've been crippled. Every time you get up, you have to reach out for those old wooden crutches, and you have to hobble over. And then anytime a horseman comes into that wilderness outpost or you hear a strange noise, you think, is this the day King David's going to find me? You've been crippled and you've been afraid the whole time you've been alive. And it's true. You're crippled. That's true. And you're a direct descendant to the throne. And that's true. All you have to do is just rise up and say, hey, I'm supposed to be king, not you, David. You better hope David never finds you. You don't have a breath of living. Chapter 9, 2 Samuel, verse 1. David, he's king, been king for several years. He begins to ask this question. Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I could show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Oh, you're in the palace. And you hear King David saying, do any of you know any children of Jonathan? And you're thinking, oh, I know why you want to find out if there's any descendants. You're afraid they're going to rise up one day and want to be king. I know where Jonathan's grandchild, or son is. I'm not going to tell him. And so David continually asks, do any of you know where the descendants of Jonathan are, if there are any? Now, do you know why David is asking that? David and Jonathan were a covenant. They cut their wrist. David has the scar. It reminds him, I'm in a covenant relationship with Jonathan. I have an obligation, now that Jonathan is dead, to take care of all of his children. Do any of you know of a child that's left alive that Jonathan had so that I can do kindness for him? You see the mixed messages? Now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They called him to appear before David, and the king says, are you Ziba? She says, yes, sir. The king asked, is there no one still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba, do you know of any one of Jonathan's children that are alive? Ziba says, yes. There's still a son of Jonathan. He's crippled in both feet. Ziba, where is he? He's at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lodebar. King David says, have him brought here to me immediately. All right, this is the morning. You wake up that morning, the air is still, and you're in a wilderness. It's desert. Nothing has really changed. You get out of bed and you reach out for those wooden crutches and you're just hobbling over to the window to look outside. And suddenly you feel the ground begin to vibrate and there's chariots coming into your little village. And you begin to get stark terror afraid. Remember? If David ever finds you, and you look, and you can tell these are from the king. The decorations on the chariot are ornate. And the soldiers are walking toward your little place. And they walk in, and they say, are you Mephibosheth? And you answer, yes. And the guard says, King David wants to see you. Well, you're paralyzed with fear. This is the day. You've been afraid of it. You've been afraid if he ever found you, you would not be alive. So you hobble over to one of the chariots and you climb aboard, and they whisk you away to the palace. And then inside the palace, you have to walk up the marble steps as best you can. and everything is perfect and ornate and expensive. And then as you walk through the corridors of the palace, hobbling along, you're thinking, how much longer do I have to live? And then they bring you into this big throne room, and you look, and there's King David sitting on the throne, your throne. You should have been there. You're a descendant of the throne. And there's King David, and you hobble along to the throne room. And Scripture says, when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. And so you bow down before King David. And King David says, "Ah, Mephibosheth, at last I found you." And you just die with fear because he's found you. How much longer do I have to live? And then David begins to talk. He looks, there's the scar on his wrist. He says, "Mephibosheth, before you were ever born, your father and I entered into a covenant relationship. And I promised that if anything ever happened to him, I would take care of his family and any children yet unborn. And at last I have found you. I'll tell you what I've done, Mephibosheth. All the land that your grandfather and your father owned, I've kept it intact. And I'm going to give it to you today. All the goats and the cattle and the sheep and whatever animals were on this land, I've kept them all intact. I'm going to give them to you today. All the stocks and bonds and investments and money and dividend accounts, I've kept all of that for you, Mephibosheth, and I'm going to give it to you today. You can't believe it. You've been living in fear of this moment. And suddenly he says, it's all yours. You're a rich man. And then King David says, oh, there's one restriction. Would you enter into covenant relationship with me? Of course you say yes. Mephibosheth, from now on, I want you to live in my palace. I want you to eat at the table with my sons. You are one of us because we are covenant brothers together. You just can't believe it. You reach out for your old wooden crutches and they say, oh, no. They bring you silver crutches. And you begin to hobble out and you just can't believe it. You're walking down the hall of the palace. There's always a servant like this that stops you and says, Mephibosheth, you ought to be ashamed for taking David's kindness. I know what you've been doing out there in Lodebar. My relative lives out there. My relative has told me how you hated King David and you were afraid for him to find you. There's always somebody like that who says, you don't deserve all this because I know what you've done. And the only answer you have is, well, you need to go ask David about the covenant. The next morning, the servant comes in and says, my lord Mephibosheth, your bath is ready. You've never had anybody draw a bath for you. My lord Mephibosheth, here are your new clothes. And King David invites you to breakfast with his other sons. You're dressed. You start down the hall. You find where they're eating together. King David says, Mephibosheth, here's your seat. You sit down. There's more than enough to eat. You've never imagined anything like this. And somebody says, King David, would you pass me the marmalade? And when he does, you notice the scar on his wrist. And you're reminded, I'm here because of a covenant that he made with my father before I was ever born. Now, this is our story. This is our story. Before you were ever born, this was put all into place. Our Lord came and said, I want to be in relationship with man, and I'm going to take care of him and all of his children and all of his children yet unborn. This is your story. He died on that cross for our story. Don't get caught up in the here and now. Well, this is what happened to the church back then, and this is what will happen. It's much bigger than that. Before you were ever born, God came along and says, I don't care what you've done. If you'll enter into covenant relationship with me, I've saved up the treasures of the world. My peace I give unto you, not as the world gives. It's the peace that I can only give to you. One more point. Matthew chapter 26, verse 27. He took the cup. He gave thanks. He offered it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of my sins. What? Every time you eat and drink, you know what you do? Lord, I'm again entering into this covenant relationship with you. I can't tell you any better story than this. That's why we're here. Strong, weak, happy, sad, whatever. That's why we're here. Because a long time ago, before we were ever born, he entered into covenant relationship with man and woman. And we come along and we're the recipients of that which was done a long time ago. We could talk about the Declaration of Independence, like our country, the same thing. Freedom, not slavery. Folks, we're a part of a scheme that was implemented thousands of years ago. And then I've got some good news. When this is over, he says, come on. I've been saving all of this up for you. Come on. Where you're going to go now, there's no pain and no tears and no suffering, and there's gladness and praise, and all of the old is gone and the new is come. Come on, I've been saving this for you. Now, it's up to you. I think it's one of the grander stories of the Bible. It all starts with, you and I like each other so much. Let's enter into covenant relationship. I thank you for inviting us to be here. We are honored to be in your presence. This is an exciting time. So many wonderful things will happen. This is the opportunity for God to show his strength. He usually just shows his strength when there is great need. Great opportunity for you as a church.